Why? I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, kept your promises, and loved your family without asking for anything back, life would find a way to make things right. It wasn't a perfect belief, but it carried me through 42 years on the railroad, through long winters, aching knees, missed birthdays, and more overnight shifts than I could count. I never expected applause for any of it. I only hoped that one day, when the work was done, I'd have a place at my family's table. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't losing my place all at once. It happened so slowly that I mistook it for ordinary life until the day I stood in my son's dining room and couldn't find my chair. That Sunday began like dozens before it. I woke before sunrise, a habit of a lifetime refusing to leave me even after retirement. The house was quiet except for the old coffee maker grumbling in the kitchen. I poured myself a mug and stood on the back porch, watching the first light creep over the neighboring rooftops. Retirement had given me something I never had during my working years: time. Funny thing about time is that it doesn't always feel like a gift. Sometimes it gives you too many hours to think about the people you miss. Daniel had invited me for dinner earlier that week. Or maybe invited wasn't exactly the right word. He'd called on Tuesday evening and said they were having everyone over on Sunday if I wanted to stop by. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just practical. We talked for less than 5 minutes before he said he had to run because dinner was ready. I remember sitting there after we hung up, staring at my phone, wondering why conversations with my only son had become shorter than the weather report. I tried not to dwell on it because there was something else on my mind. Emma had been asking me for weeks to teach her how to make my apple pie. She was 11 now, old enough to measure flour without spilling half of it across the counter, and patient enough to peel apples one strip at a time. The last Saturday she visited, we'd spent the afternoon laughing in my kitchen. She dusted herself with flour until she looked like she'd been caught in a snowstorm. And every time the dough stuck to the rolling pin, she'd giggle so hard that I forgot I was supposed to be teaching instead of laughing with her. When she left that evening, she'd hugged me tight and whispered, "Next Sunday, Grandpa, you have to bring your pie. I promised I would. Promises matter more when you're my age. You start realizing they're all you really own." By 9 o'clock that morning, the pie was cooling on the counter. I wrapped it carefully in the old blue towel my wife, Margaret, had sewn years ago. She used to say a homemade pie deserved better than plastic wrap. I still heard her voice whenever I folded that towel over warm pastry. Some habits become conversations with people who are no longer here. Before leaving, I picked up my old railroad pocket watch from the kitchen shelf. It hadn't worked in years, but I carried it anyway. The brass was scratched from decades of riding in my pocket, and the chain had been repaired twice. Every mark on it reminded me of another shift, another mile, another reason I'd kept going when I was too tired to think straight. I slipped it into my jacket the way I always did whenever something important was happening. The drive to Daniel's house took about 20 minutes. The same streets I'd driven for years looked different now that I wasn't rushing somewhere. Kids rode bicycles along the sidewalks. A man watered his lawn while waving to neighbors. Families filled grocery store parking lots, loading trunks with bags for the week ahead. It all looked ordinary, steady, familiar. I remember thinking that maybe I'd been worrying over nothing. Melissa opened the front door before I reached it. She smiled politely, the kind of smile people wear because manners require it. "Hi, Thomas," she said. "Come on in." She hadn't called me Dad in years. I told myself not to notice. The house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. Voices drifted from the dining room along with Emma's laughter, bright and impossible to mistake. She ran toward me the second she saw the pie. "You remembered." "I told you I would." She hugged me around the waist before carefully taking the pie into the kitchen like it was made of glass. Watching her made something inside me feel lighter. Children have a way of making you believe everything is still simple. Daniel stepped into the hallway a moment later and gave me a quick hug. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough to remind me how tall he'd become. Funny how a father still sees the little boy, even when the little boy has gray beginning to show at his temples. "Good to see you, Dad." "You too, son." For a while, everything felt normal. I chatted with Daniel about baseball. Emma told me about a science project involving plants that refused to grow in her classroom. Melissa moved between the kitchen and dining room, setting plates on the table while speaking mostly to everyone else. I didn't take it personally. She always liked things done a certain way before dinner. Then she called everyone to eat. People stood up around me, carrying drinks and passing bowls toward the dining room. I followed behind, smiling, as Emma proudly announced that Grandpa had made dessert. The dining table looked beautiful. Melissa had decorated it with fresh flowers and matching plates. There were chairs all around it, except where mine had always been. I stopped walking without meaning to. Maybe someone had moved it. Maybe another chair was coming. I looked around the room once, then again. Nothing. My place at the end of the table was gone. There wasn't even an empty space where the chair used to sit. Another serving cart had been rolled against that side of the table, as though no one had ever planned for someone to sit there at all. Daniel noticed me standing still. "Oh," he said casually, almost as if he'd forgotten something small. "We needed a little more room, Dad." I looked from him to the table again. Melissa adjusted a serving bowl without looking up. "There just wasn't enough space," she added. "We figured this worked better." No one sounded angry. No one sounded embarrassed. That somehow made it hurt more. I held my smile because I didn't know what else to do. My eyes drifted across the room, searching for another chair, another place, any sign that someone had simply overlooked a detail. Instead, I found Emma staring back at me with a confused expression, as though she was wondering the very same thing I was, but hadn't yet found the courage to ask. Emma looked from me to her father, then back to the table again. Children notice things adults spend years pretending not to see. She tilted her head and frowned in that thoughtful way she'd had ever since she was little. Before anyone else could sit down, she asked the question that hung in the room like a heavy cloud. "Where's Grandpa's chair?" For just a second, nobody answered. Melissa continued arranging silverware as though she hadn't heard, while Daniel reached for a bowl of mashed potatoes with a little too much interest. I could almost hear everyone searching for an explanation that sounded reasonable enough for an 11-year-old. "We just needed more space, sweetheart," Melissa finally said with a pleasant smile. "Grandpa can sit over there?" She pointed toward a folding chair sitting against the kitchen wall, several feet away from the table. It wasn't even pulled out. It looked like something someone remembered at the last minute. Emma frowned again. "But Grandpa always sits with us. It's only for tonight," Daniel added quickly. I forced a smile before Emma could argue. "It's all right, honey. A chair's a chair." The words came out easier than I expected, though I didn't believe them for a second. I carried the folding chair over myself and set it near the corner of the room. From there, I could see everyone, but I wasn't really part of the table anymore. There wasn't enough room to rest my elbows, and every time someone reached for a serving dish, I had to lean back to stay out of the way. Dinner moved on as though nothing unusual had happened. Emma kept trying to include me in the conversation, telling me about the bean plants she'd been growing for science class. She'd named one of them George because, according to her, every plant deserves a proper name. I laughed at that, genuinely laughed, and for a moment the ache in my chest eased. Daniel asked a few questions about the garden behind my house, and I answered them while watching him carve the chicken. His face looked more tired than I remembered. There were faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. He wasn't an unkind man. That was what made everything so confusing. I couldn't figure out how the little boy who used to wait by the window every Friday for me to come home from work had become a man who didn't seem to notice his father eating from a folding chair. Melissa kept the conversation moving, mostly talking about school schedules, grocery prices, and neighbors I'd never met. Every now and then, she'd glance toward me with the same polite expression she'd greeted me with at the door. There was nothing openly hostile about her. If someone had walked in halfway through dinner, they probably would have thought we were an ordinary family sharing a pleasant Sunday meal. Sometimes the deepest hurts wear the friendliest faces. After dessert, Emma insisted everyone try the apple pie before anything else. She proudly announced that she'd help make it, leaving out the part where she'd eaten nearly as many apple slices as she'd peeled, watching. Her beam as everyone complimented the pie reminded me of Margaret. My wife always believed good food could mend almost anything. Sitting there that evening, I wished she had been right. When dinner ended, people drifted into the living room with coffee while I quietly gathered the empty pie dish. Melissa reached for it before I could carry it to the sink. "I'll take care of that. Thank you." Her voice stayed pleasant, but there was something practiced about the exchange, as though we'd both memorized our lines years ago. Emma tugged gently on my sleeve. "Grandpa, come see my room. I want to show you something." I followed her upstairs, grateful for the excuse to step away. Her bedroom walls were covered with drawings, school awards, and photographs. She knelt beside her desk and pulled out a folder bursting with construction paper. I saved all my favorite pictures. She spread them across the floor one by one. There were drawings of dogs, rainbows, birthday cakes, and family vacations that looked nothing like the real ones. Then she paused on a picture she'd made years earlier. Remember this? I did. It was a crayon drawing of the whole family sitting around a dining table. The colors were uneven, and everyone's heads were too big for their bodies, but there was no mistaking who each person was. Daniel sat beside Melissa. Emma sat between them. Margaret, who had already passed away by the time Emma drew it, had angel wings because that was how a 6-year-old understood heaven. And there I was, sitting at the end of the table. My chair was colored bright blue. You said blue was your lucky color, Emma reminded me. I smiled, though it felt harder than before. You remembered that. I remember lots of things. She looked down at the drawing for a long moment before asking quietly, why didn't you have your chair today? Children don't ask questions to make you uncomfortable. They ask because they expect honest answers. I sat beside her on the carpet and looked at the picture instead of her face. Sometimes grown-ups move things around, but they'll put it back next time, right? Look, there it was again. That simple faith children carry without even knowing it. I wanted to borrow it for myself. I suppose we'll see. She slipped her small hand into mine and squeezed it. If they forget again, you can have mine. I laughed softly, though my throat tightened. Then where would you sit? Next to you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Margaret used to say that children often tell the truth adults are too afraid to admit. Emma had no idea how much those few words meant to me. When it was time to leave, Daniel walked me to the front porch. The evening air had turned cool, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. We stood beside my truck for a minute, neither of us saying much. Thanks for coming, Dad. I wouldn't miss seeing Emma. He nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets. She's always excited when you visit. I know. There were a dozen questions I could have asked. Why had my chair disappeared? Why hadn't he called as often? Had I done something wrong without realizing it? But standing there beneath the porch light, looking at my son's tired face, none of those questions felt like they would bring us closer. Instead, I simply patted him on the shoulder. You take care of yourself, son. You too. As I drove home through the quiet streets, Emma's drawing rested on the passenger seat beside the empty pie dish. At the first red light, I glanced at the bright blue chair she'd colored years ago. Somewhere between that picture and the dinner table I just left, something had changed in my family. I just didn't know when it had started or who had decided I no longer belonged. The drive home felt longer than 20 minutes that night. Maybe it was because I wasn't in any hurry to get back to an empty house, or maybe it was because my mind kept replaying the same few moments over and over again. Every time I stopped at a red light, I found myself looking at Emma's drawing lying on the passenger seat. In her picture, there had never been any question about where Grandpa belonged. Children draw the world the way they believe it should be, not the way adults slowly allow it to become. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light came on automatically, just as it had every evening since Margaret insisted we install it years ago. A home should always look like it's waiting for someone, she'd said. Even after 15 years without her, I never found the heart to change that timer. The light greeted me every night, whether anyone else was coming or not. Inside, the silence settled around me like an old coat. I placed the empty pie dish in the sink, set Emma's drawing carefully on the kitchen table, and hung my jacket over the same chair I always used. As I reached into my pocket, the old railroad watch slipped into my hand. I turned it over for a moment, rubbing my thumb across the scratched brass. It hadn't kept time in years, but somehow it still reminded me that every hour I'd spent away from home had been spent for the people I loved. I made myself a cup of tea, even though I wasn't thirsty. Margaret used to laugh because she claimed I only drank tea when something was bothering me. Coffee wakes you up, she'd say. Tea helps you think. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, I wished she were across from me, smiling over the rim of her mug and telling me I was making too much out of one awkward dinner. Maybe she would have been right. Monday morning arrived with the same routine I'd followed ever since retiring. I watered the tomatoes in the backyard, swept the porch, and walked to the mailbox even though I already knew there probably wouldn't be anything important inside. Retirement had taught me that routines aren't just about getting things done. They're about reminding yourself that life is still moving even when it feels like the people around you are moving without you. The mailbox held a utility bill, a grocery flyer, and one envelope addressed in Emma's neat handwriting. I smiled before I even opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper covered with colorful markers. Grandpa, thank you for making pie with me. Dad says practice makes perfect. Next time mine will look almost as good as yours. I saved you the biggest hug for next Sunday. At the bottom, she'd drawn another little blue chair. I stared at it longer than I probably should have. It wasn't just a doodle, she'd remembered. That afternoon, I decided to stop by the hardware store for birdseed and a few things I'd been putting off buying. As I walked through the garden section, I heard someone call my name. Tom Bennett, is that really you? I turned to see Frank Dawson pushing a shopping cart full of paint cans. Frank and I had worked together on the railroad for nearly 20 years before he retired a few months after I did. His back had bent a little more over the years, but his grin hadn't changed at all. I'll be, I said, shaking his hand. Still keeping yourself busy? My wife makes sure of it. We laughed, the kind of easy laugh that only comes from knowing someone for decades. We wandered through the aisles talking about old coworkers, fishing trips we'd never actually taken, and how neither of us missed climbing onto freezing train cars before dawn. For the first time since Sunday, I felt like myself again. Frank asked a simple question. So how's Daniel doing? He's doing fine in the grandkid, growing faster than I'd like. Frank smiled. You're lucky, my boys moved 3 states away. I don't get to see my grandkids much. I still see Emma. You have Sunday dinners, don't you? I remember you talking about those. I hesitated. We try to. He must have noticed something in my face because he didn't ask another question. Instead, he patted my shoulder the way railroad men often do when words aren't enough. Families go through seasons, Tom. I suppose they do, but don't stay quiet forever if something's bothering you. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why those words stayed with me long after we left the store. Over the next 2 weeks, little things began adding up in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Daniel usually called every Wednesday evening, even if it was only for 5 minutes. That call never came. I thought about calling him myself, but decided against it. A father shouldn't have to chase every conversation with his own son. The following Saturday, I drove to Emma's soccer game. I'd been to almost every game she had ever played. Rain or sunshine, winning or losing, I'd always found a place on the sidelines. This time, I arrived just before kickoff and scanned the row of folding chairs near the field. Daniel waved politely when he noticed me. Melissa looked surprised. Thomas, she said as I walked over. We didn't know you were coming. I smiled. Emma told me her schedule last week. For just a second, Melissa glanced at Daniel before answering. Oh, right, it wasn't much, just 2 words, but something about them lingered. Emma spotted me before the game started and came running across the grass, with her cleats half untied. You came. I told you I would. She threw her arms around me, completely unconcerned with the parents watching nearby. Children don't worry about appearances. They love the people they love. After the game, while Emma ran off to get her team snack, I overheard Melissa speaking quietly to another parent only a few feet away. She didn't realize I was close enough to hear. We've just been trying to keep things simple lately. The other woman nodded sympathetically. It can't be easy. No, Melissa replied softly. Sometimes older people don't realize when they're becoming a little too dependent. Dependent. The word hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't borrowed money from Daniel. I hadn't asked to move into their home. I paid my own bills, drove my own truck, and took care of my own house. So why would anyone describe me that way? Before I could make sense of it, Melissa turned and saw me standing there. Her smile appeared almost instantly. Oh, Thomas, I didn't see you. I'm sure you didn't, I answered gently. She looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd known her. The drive home that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about that single word, dependent. It didn't sound like something Melissa had made up on the spot. It sounded like something she'd been saying for a long time. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether my son had been hearing that story long before I ever noticed my chair had disappeared. The word stayed with me for the rest of the weekend. It followed me while I trimmed the hedges in the front yard, while I folded laundry, and even while I sat on the porch watching the neighborhood settle into another quiet Sunday evening. I'd spent my entire adult life trying not to become a burden to anyone. I paid my bills on time, fixed what I could with my own hands, and asked for help only when there was no other choice. Yet somehow, somewhere, I'd become the old man people whispered about when they thought he wasn't listening. Monday morning brought rain, the kind that fell steadily without much wind. I found myself sorting through old boxes in the hallway closet simply because it gave me something to do. Retirement teaches you that busy hands can sometimes quiet a restless mind. Most of the boxes held ordinary things: old Christmas decorations, photo albums, Margaret's sewing patterns, and cards Emma had made over the years. I smiled at each crooked drawing she had given me, amazed at how quickly children's handwriting changes while their hearts stay exactly the same. One photograph slipped from an album and landed face up on the floor. It showed the dining room in my old house nearly 12 years earlier. Daniel was younger, Emma was still sitting in a high chair, and Margaret was laughing about something outside the frame. The table looked smaller back then, but everyone fit around it comfortably. At the very end sat my chair, the same chair Emma had colored blue in her drawing years later. I picked up the picture and studied every face. No one looked distracted. No one looked impatient. We were simply together, and somehow that had been enough. I tucked the photograph into the same folder as Emma's drawing before returning the albums to the closet. As I closed the door, my phone rang. The screen showed a name I hadn't expected: Linda Morales. I hadn't spoken to Linda in almost a year. She'd handled legal paperwork for Margaret and me long before Daniel was married. She was the kind of attorney who remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, and never made you feel like you were watching a clock every time you sat in her office. After Margaret passed away, Linda helped me organize everything I hoped I'd never need. Once the paperwork was finished, we only exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional phone call. "Thomas," she said warmly after I answered, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Linda. It's good to hear your voice." We spent a few minutes catching up. She asked about my garden. I asked whether she'd finally convinced herself to retire. She laughed and admitted she still wasn't ready. Then her tone became more thoughtful. "I've been reviewing some long-term client files. Yours came across my desk this morning." "My files?" "Yes." I frowned, trying to remember what business I could possibly have left unfinished. "There isn't a problem." "No," she answered quickly. "Nothing urgent. I just realized it's been several years since we've updated anything. At your age, it's usually wise to review important documents every so often." She was right, of course. People my age didn't like talking about wills or legal papers, but pretending time wasn't moving never stopped it from moving.
I suppose that's overdue. It is.
"Would you be willing to stop by my office sometime this week? It shouldn't take long." "Sure." "Wednesday morning work?" "Perfect." Before hanging up, she hesitated. "And Thomas, yes, bring your reading glasses." I chuckled. "I always do." "No," she said gently. "I think you'll want them." The call ended before I could ask what she meant. For the next 2 days, I tried not to think too much about it. There were probably dozens of harmless reasons Linda wanted to review paperwork. Still, every now and then, her final sentence drifted back into my thoughts. "I think you'll want them." Wednesday arrived bright and cool after the rain had finally moved through. Linda's office hadn't changed much over the years. The same brick building stood on the corner downtown, with flower boxes beneath the front windows and a brass plaque beside the door that Margaret used to polish with the sleeve of her sweater whenever she visited, just to tease Linda about lawyers needing cleaner signs. The receptionist greeted me by name before leading me into Linda's office. She stood to shake my hand. "It's good to see you." "You too." "Why?" Her office felt exactly as I remembered. Bookshelves lining every wall, family photographs on the desk, and a large window overlooking Main Street. She motioned for me to sit before pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "I still remember how you take it," she said. "1 cream. And no sugar. Some people make you feel remembered in ways you don't even realize you've missed." We spent several minutes reviewing ordinary paperwork. My address hadn't changed. Neither had my emergency contact information. We discussed medical directives and insurance forms. Everything seemed routine enough that I began wondering why she'd sounded so serious on the phone. Then she opened a drawer in her desk. From inside, she removed a large manila envelope. It was sealed. Across the front, in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. "Only if absolutely necessary." My heartbeat slowed. I hadn't seen Margaret's handwriting in years. Without realizing it, I leaned forward. Linda rested one hand lightly on the envelope but didn't slide it toward me. "You remember this?" "I remember signing something," I said quietly. "I don't remember." It was prepared after Margaret became ill." I nodded slowly. Those months had blurred together in my memory. Hospital visits, medication schedules, endless paperwork. There were entire conversations I barely remembered having. "You both gave me very specific instructions." I looked from Linda to the envelope. "What kind of instructions?" Her expression remained calm, professional, but there was kindness behind it. "That this envelope was never to be opened unless certain conditions were met." I swallowed. And have they? Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands together and studied me for a long moment. Before I answer that, she said carefully, I need to ask you something. All right, has anything changed recently between you and Daniel? The question caught me completely off guard. Looked down at the envelope again. For the first time since the missing chair, I wondered whether the little moments I'd been trying so hard to dismiss weren't isolated incidents at all. Maybe someone else had seen the pattern long before I had. And maybe whatever rested inside that sealed envelope had been waiting patiently all these years for a day neither Margaret nor I had ever hoped would come. Looked at Linda for several seconds before answering. My first instinct was to protect Daniel. Parents do that, even when their children are grown. We spend so many years explaining away scraped knees and poor decisions that it becomes second nature to explain away the hurts they cause us, too. I suppose every family has rough patches, I said quietly. Linda didn't argue. She simply nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. Thomas, I've known you for over 30 years. Whenever something painful happens, your first response has always been to make it sound smaller than it really is. I managed a faint smile. Margaret used to say the same thing. She was usually right. The room fell silent. Outside the window, people walked along Main Street carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, completely unaware that my heart had begun beating a little faster. Whatever this meeting had been about, it wasn't just a routine review anymore. Linda folded her hands on the desk. So let me ask differently. Have you begun feeling unwelcome? The word landed harder than I expected. Not unwanted, not abandoned, unwelcome. There was something painfully accurate about it. I looked down at the envelope again before answering. I don't think Daniel means to hurt me. I didn't ask about Daniel. That caught me off guard. I asked how you feel. I let out a slow breath. I paused, searching for words that didn't sound dramatic. I think I've been telling myself everything is fine because I don't know what I'd do if it wasn't. Linda's expression softened. What happened? For the first time, I told someone about the missing chair. I described the folding chair in the corner of the dining room, Emma asking where Grandpa's seat had gone, and the strange feeling of sitting close enough to hear everyone but somehow too far away to belong. I mentioned overhearing Melissa call me dependent at the soccer field. I admitted Daniel's phone calls had become fewer and shorter. I expected Linda to tell me I was reading too much into ordinary family changes. She didn't. Instead, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached for the envelope again, but still didn't hand it to me. I hoped I would never have this conversation. What does that mean? She looked toward the window for a moment before answering. Years ago, after Margaret received her diagnosis, the two of you met with me several times. I nodded. Now you weren't planning for money? We weren't? No, she smiled sadly. You were planning for relationships. What? That surprised me. Linda continued carefully. Margaret worried about something. Not because she distrusted Daniel, but because she understood people. I frowned. What did she worry about? She worried that one day your kindness might become invisible. I stared at her. She used those exact words. My throat tightened. She believed people can become so accustomed to quiet sacrifice that eventually they stop seeing it altogether. Not because they're cruel, but because consistency is easy to overlook. Looked away. That sounded exactly like Margaret. She had always noticed the things everyone else missed. If that happened, Linda continued, she wanted to make sure you were protected, not financially, but emotionally. I couldn't quite understand what she meant. How can legal papers protect someone emotionally? They can't. She rested her fingertips lightly on the sealed envelope. But the truth can. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me since I walked into her office. What's inside? I'm not permitted to tell you. You've seen it, I have, and you still can't? She shook her head. Not unless the conditions your wife established have clearly been met. I leaned back in the chair. What exactly were those conditions? Linda hesitated. They were intentionally broad. Margaret believed life couldn't be reduced to a checklist. Despite everything, I smiled. That sounds like her. It does. Linda picked up a sheet of paper from beside the envelope. The instruction says the envelope may only be opened if there is credible evidence that Thomas has become isolated from his immediate family through misunderstanding, manipulation, or hidden deception, and only if revealing its contents offers the best chance of restoring the truth rather than punishing anyone. The words echoed through the room. Manipulation, hid deception. Those Those weren't words Margaret used carelessly. Linda met my eyes. I think something is happening. There was a difference. One was certainty, the other was concern. What if we're wrong? I asked. What if this is just a misunderstanding? Then we wait. Then timing becomes very important. I rub my hands together slowly. I don't want to accuse anyone. I know. I don't want Daniel choosing between me and his wife. I know. I don't want Emma caught in the middle. I know. Why? She answered every concern with the same calm certainty, as though she'd anticipated every one of them years ago. Thomas, she said gently, your wife never wanted this envelope to divide your family. What did she want? The opposite. I closed my eyes for a moment. Margaret had always believed the truth was like sunlight. Sometimes it exposed dust you'd rather ignore, but it also made it possible to clean the room. When I opened my eyes again, Linda slid the envelope back into the drawer. I don't believe today is the day. That surprised me. I thought you called me because I needed to know whether the conditions were beginning to exist. And I believe we're getting closer. The words should have relieved me. Instead, they frightened me. If we were only beginning, what else was still waiting to happen? Linda stood and walked to one of the bookshelves. From a small box, she removed a business card and handed it to me. My direct number. I already have your office number. This one reaches only me. I slipped it in my wallet. If anything changes, anything at all, you call me. I will, no matter how small it seems. I nodded. As I reached the door, Linda spoke one final time. Thomas. I turned. Don't start doubting your own memories. I frowned. What do you mean? When people slowly rewrite a relationship, the first thing the other person begins questioning is themselves. I stood there quietly. I've seen it happen before. Driving home, those words stayed with me almost as much as the envelope had. Don't start doubting your own memories. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Emma's drawing beside the old family photograph. In both pictures, my place at the table was unmistakable. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining the distance. Instead, I began asking a different question. If someone had slowly convinced my son that I no longer belonged, when had that story really begun? And how many years had I failed to notice it? I wish I could tell you that after meeting with Linda, everything settled down and life slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Instead, it felt as though someone had adjusted the focus on an old camera. The world hadn't changed overnight, but details I had ignored for years suddenly became impossible to miss. It wasn't that people started behaving differently. It was that I finally stopped explaining everything away before I had a chance to see it for what it was. The following week passed quietly. I spent my mornings in the garden, tying up tomato vines that had grown wild after the rain. Margaret always said tomatoes needed gentle guidance more than force. If you pull too hard, she'd tell me, you'll break the very thing you're trying to help. As I worked, I found myself wondering if people were much different. Maybe relationships needed the same kind of patience. Maybe I'd been pulling in the wrong direction without realizing it. Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. For a second, I smiled before answering. Hey, son. Hi, Dad. His voice sounded distracted, like he was talking while doing something else. I was just checking in. I appreciate that. We exchanged a few ordinary questions about the weather, my garden, and whether I'd finally fixed the loose gutter over the garage. It was pleasant enough, but there was something careful about the conversation, as if neither of us wanted to wander into territory that might become uncomfortable. Just before we hung up, I asked, how's work treating you? He sighed. Busy. Everything all right? Yeah, just a lot going on. I waited, giving him room to say more. He didn't. Well, I said, don't work yourself too hard. I won't. After we said goodbye, I stared at the phone for several moments. He had called. That mattered. But somehow it also felt like he'd called because he believed he should, not because he'd wanted to hear my voice. It was a small difference. Small differences have a way of becoming large distances. A few days later, Emma called from her mother's phone. Grandpa, her excitement filled the line before I could even answer. I have something to show you. What is it? It's a surprise. I laughed. That's not much of a clue. You'll see. She lowered her voice. Does your mom know you're inviting me? There was a tiny pause. I think so. The answer made me smile and worry at the same time. I'll call your dad first. Okay. She sounded just a little disappointed. After we hung up, I dialed Daniel. He answered on the third ring. Hey, Dad, Emma invited me over tomorrow. Another brief silence. Oh, I just wanted to make sure It was a good time. Tomorrow. He hesitated. I think we're actually pretty busy. That's all right. Maybe another day. His words were polite, too polite. I'll tell Emma. I already spoke with her. I know. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Finally, he cleared his throat. We'll figure something out. Whenever it works. We hung up. I wasn't angry. Mostly I was confused. Emma believed I could come. Daniel believed I couldn't. Lee. Somewhere between those two conversations sat a piece of the story I still couldn't see. The next afternoon, I decided not to spend the day wondering about it. Instead, I drove to the public library, a place Margaret and I used to visit every month. She loved history books, while I wandered through biographies and old railroad collections. The building hadn't changed much over the years, and walking through those doors always felt strangely comforting. As I browsed the shelves, I heard someone calling softly behind me. Mr. Bennett? I turned to find Mrs. Collins, Emma's fifth-grade teacher. She smiled warmly. It's nice to see you. You too. I wanted to thank you. For what? She looked genuinely surprised. For volunteering during our family history week. I blinked. I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else. Her smile faded. Oh, she looked embarrassed. You thought what? I was told you couldn't make it because you weren't feeling well. For a moment, I simply stared at her. I wasn't invited. Mrs. Collins' face changed immediately. I'm so sorry. You don't need to apologize. She searched for words. Emma talked about you constantly during that project. She brought photographs of the two of you making pie together. She said you knew more family stories than anyone. A tight feeling settled in my chest. When was this? About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, Lee. The same week Daniel had told me they were too busy to get together. Mrs. Collins lowered her voice. I shouldn't have. You shouldn't have. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. I hope I didn't upset you. I forced a small smile. Flirty. You answered a question I didn't know I needed to ask. After leaving the library, I sat in my truck for nearly 10 minutes without starting the engine. 3 weeks earlier, Emma had expected me to be there. Her teacher had expected me to be there. Someone had told the school I was sick, but no one had told me there was anything to attend. That wasn't forgetting. Someone had made a decision. The thought followed me all the way home. That evening, I walked into the garage looking for something to keep my hands busy. My old workbench still held coffee cans filled with screws, bolts, and spare hinges collected over decades. As I searched for a tape measure, eyes landed on a small wooden birdhouse sitting on the top shelf. Emma and I had built it together 4 summers earlier. The roof leaned slightly to one side because she'd insisted crooked houses gave birds more personality. I smiled despite everything. Then, I noticed something tucked inside the birdhouse, a folded piece of paper. I reached in and carefully unfolded it. It was one of Emma's little notes. In uneven handwriting, it read, Grandpa, if I ever can't find you, I'll know you're at home because you always keep your promises. There wasn't a date. There didn't need to be. I sat down on the old workshop stool, reading those words again and again. She believed I would always be there. The question that troubled me wasn't whether I would keep my promises. It was whether someone else had quietly been breaking theirs, and whether Daniel even realized it was happening. The next morning, I woke before the alarm I no longer needed. Sleep had become lighter over the past few weeks, not because of age, but because unanswered questions have a way of waking you before the sun does. I made coffee, carried it to the porch, and watched the neighborhood slowly come alive. A newspaper landed on a driveway across the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a young father walked his daughter to the school bus while she held his hand. Watching them reminded me of Daniel when he was that age. Every morning, he'd squeeze my hand just a little tighter before climbing onto the bus, then turn around twice to wave before it pulled away. Back then, I never imagined there would come a day when waving goodbye to my son would feel so different. I spent most of that morning trying to stay busy. The garage needed organizing, and there were loose boards on the back fence that had been waiting for my attention. I had just finished replacing one of them when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda Morales. Good morning, Thomas. Morning, Linda. I hope I'm not interrupting. You never do. She paused for a moment before continuing. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Has anything new happened since we last spoke? I thought about the library, Mrs. Collins, and Emma's note hidden inside the birdhouse. Yes, I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she sighed quietly. I was afraid of that. You sound like you were expecting it. I wasn't expecting this exact situation. I was expecting a pattern. I leaned against the workbench. What kind of pattern? The kind where one misunderstanding can be explained. 2 raises concern. 3 begin telling a story. I looked out the open garage door toward the empty driveway. It doesn't feel like one story. That's because you're living it one piece at a time. Her words stayed with me, living it one piece at a time. Maybe that was why it had taken me so long to notice. No single moment had been big enough to stop the world. It was dozens of little moments, each one easy to forgive on its own. Thomas, Linda said gently, I'd like you to come by tomorrow afternoon. Another meeting? Yes. Why? I've received something. What is it? I'd rather show you. There was something in her voice that told me this wasn't ordinary. I'll be there. The next afternoon, Linda met me in the reception area instead of her office. She seemed unusually thoughtful as she led me inside, carrying a slim folder instead of the large legal files she normally used. I didn't expect this, she admitted after we sat down. What happened? Why? She opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It wasn't a legal document. It was a copy of a bank statement. I frowned. I don't understand. You don't need to understand the numbers. What am I looking at? She pointed to a date near the top. Do you remember 7 years ago when Daniel told everyone his business survived a difficult financial year because of a bank refinancing agreement? I nodded. Of course. At the time, Daniel had been under tremendous pressure. His small construction company had nearly collapsed after 2 large clients failed to pay on time. I remembered worrying about him constantly, though eventually he'd assured me everything had worked out. Linda looked at me carefully. That's not exactly what happened. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What do you mean? I can't explain everything yet. Why not? Because this document alone doesn't tell the whole story. Looked at the statement again. It listed a large payment made on the same week Daniel's business had recovered. The amount made my heart skip. I recognized it immediately. Not because of the number, because I knew exactly where that amount had once existed, my retirement savings. I looked back at Linda. I remember transferring that money. She nodded. So do I. My voice grew quieter. Daniel told me it would only be temporary. He did. He promised he'd pay it back when things improved. He believed he would. I closed my eyes for a moment. I'd almost forgotten that conversation, not because it wasn't important, but because I'd never considered it a sacrifice. Parents help their children. That's simply what they do. When I opened my eyes again, Linda was watching me closely. Thomas, I never told anyone. I know. I didn't want Daniel to feel guilty. I know. I rubbed my forehead. I don't understand why we're talking about this now, because that wasn't the only financial decision made during that time. Those words immediately caught my attention. What else happened? Linda reached into the folder, but stopped before removing the next document. I need you to answer one question first. Electly. All right. If learning the complete truth damaged Daniel's marriage, would you still want to know it? The question hit harder than anything she'd asked before. I thought about Emma, about the blue chair in her drawing, about Daniel standing on the porch, thanking me for dinner without realizing what I'd been feeling. I don't want to destroy my son's family. I know, but that's not what I asked. The room became painfully quiet. Finally, I answered. I want the truth, Linda. Linda held my gaze for several seconds before giving a slow nod. I was hoping you'd say that. She carefully removed another document from the folder and placed it beside the first. This one wasn't a bank statement. It was a copy of a mortgage satisfaction record. My name appeared near the top because of my old house, the house I'd lived in with Margaret for nearly 30 years. My chest tightened. I remember signing those papers. So do I. I sold it after Margaret passed. Linda looked at me gently. No, Thomas. I frowned. Yes, I did. You signed the papers. Then what are you saying? She folded her hands. You didn't sell your home because you wanted to move. A cold feeling spread through me. You signed because someone convinced you there was no other way to save Daniel. The room seemed to grow very still. Pieces of I'd never connected began surfacing all at once. Late-night phone calls. Daniel's worried voice, meetings at the bank, Melissa explaining numbers I barely understood, assurances that it was only the safest option. I had trusted them. Every word. Before I could speak, there was a knock on Linda's office door. Her assistant stepped inside. I'm sorry to interrupt. Linda looked up. What is it? Your 4 o'clock appointment arrived early. Linda glanced at her schedule, then back at me. Can you give us just a few more minutes? The assistant nodded. Of course. As the door closed, Linda looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Thomas, she said quietly, what I'm about to show you next is the document that changes everything. She rested her hand on the final paper inside the folder, but didn't turn it over. For the first time since this began, I wasn't sure I was ready to see it. Linda kept her hand resting on the folder, almost as if she were giving me one last chance to walk away. I had known her long enough to recognize that expression. She wasn't trying to build suspense. She was trying to protect me. There are moments in life when you can still choose ignorance. And once that choice disappears, there's no putting the truth back where you found it. I need you to understand something before you read this, she said quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready. Everything you're about to see is supported by documentation. None of it is rumor. None of it is assumption. I swallowed hard. And Daniel? He never saw these records. Lee. That answer surprised me more than anything else she'd said all afternoon. You mean he doesn't know? I believe he knows pieces of the story. And the rest? Linda shook her head. I don't believe anyone ever showed him. She slowly turned the document toward me. It was a settlement statement from the closing on my old house. At first, it looked like any other legal paperwork. Dates, signatures, dollar amounts. But then Linda pointed to a section near the bottom. This is where the proceeds went. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked closer. Part of the money matched the retirement transfer I already remembered. The rest had been sent directly to a commercial account belonging to Daniel's construction company, not a bank, not a lender. His company. I stared at the page, trying to make sense of it. I thought. My voice barely came out. I thought the bank required this? That's what... I looked up. It wasn't true. The bank required additional capital. She paused carefully. It never required you to sell your home. I felt as though someone had quietly pulled the floor out from under me. For years, I'd remembered that time as difficult but necessary. Daniel's business had been struggling. Margaret had been gone less than a year. I was still learning how to live in a house that suddenly felt much too quiet. When Daniel came to me worried about losing everything he'd worked for, helping him never felt like a decision. It felt like being his father. I signed willingly, I whispered. You did. I wasn't forced. No. But willingness and full understanding aren't always the same thing. I looked back down at the papers. Memories I hadn't visited in years began returning one after another. Melissa sitting beside Daniel during meetings because she said she handled the finances better. Stackers of documents spread across my dining room table. Phrases like, this is the safest option, and we'll fix everything once the business recovers. I remembered asking very few questions, not because I didn't trust them. I never imagined. I stopped speaking. What? I never imagined anyone would need to convince me to help my son. Linda gave a slow nod. Exactly, Lee. She reached into the folder again and removed a handwritten note attached to the closing documents. It wasn't written by Margaret. It was written by the bank manager who had handled the file. The note summarized a meeting that had taken place the week before the closing. I recognized the manager's name immediately. Harold Simmons had retired years ago. Linda pointed to one sentence. Mr. Bennett repeatedly asked whether selling his residence was the only available option. Alternative financing options were discussed but declined by the business representatives. I read the sentence 3 times. Business representatives? Linda answered softly. Daniel and Melissa attended that meeting, so there were other options. According to the bank records, yes, but they chose this one. They did. I closed my eyes not because I was angry, because I suddenly remembered something I'd forgotten for years. The night before I signed the papers, Daniel had come to my house alone. He'd looked exhausted. He'd sat at my kitchen table, turning his coffee cup in circles. Finally, he'd said, "Why? I hate asking this of you." I had reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. "You're not asking," I'd told him. "We're family." At the time, I thought those words had lifted a burden from him. Now I wasn't so sure. "What are you thinking?" Linda asked. "I keep remembering Daniel, and he looked ashamed." She waited. "I don't think that look was fake." "I don't either." Her answer came so quickly that I looked up. "You don't?" "No," she folded her hands. "Thomas, Lee, I've spent enough years working with families to recognize something important." "What?" There are people who create deception. She paused. And there are people who slowly begin living inside it. I thought about Daniel's tired face. Lie. His shorter phone calls, the hesitation every time we spoke, the confusion that seemed to flicker across his face whenever Emma asked simple questions. For the first time, I wondered whether my son had been carrying doubts he didn't know how to name. I think he believed what he was repeatedly told. The room fell quiet again. Linda closed the folder but didn't put it away. There are still documents you haven't seen. I looked at her. How many? Enough to explain the rest. And today? She shook her head. No. I frowned. Why stop now? Because the next documents don't only explain the financial decisions. She took a slow breath. They explain what happened afterward. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? The years after the sale. I felt my stomach tighten. Linda continued gently. If I'm right, someone didn't simply persuade you to make one sacrifice. She looked directly into my eyes. Believe someone spent years making sure that sacrifice would eventually be forgotten. Those words hurt more than discovering the money, not because I needed credit. I had never wanted recognition, but forgetting a sacrifice is one thing. Replacing it with a story that the person who made it had become a burden, that was something entirely different. As I prepared to leave, Linda handed me photocopies of only the documents we'd discussed. No more than this, she said. I trust you. No, read them tonight. I will, and don't confront anyone. I slipped the papers into a large envelope. I wasn't planning to. I believe you. She walked me to the front door of her office. Just before I stepped outside, she spoke one more time. Thomas. Yes, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. I waited. It arrives when people are finally capable of carrying it. I drove home in silence. When I reached my house, I didn't go inside immediately. Instead, I sat behind the steering wheel, looking through the windshield. At the porch Margaret had loved so much. The porch light wasn't on yet. The evening sun still filled the yard. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But for the first time, I realized the greatest loss in my life might not have been the home I'd given up. It might have been the years my son had spent believing a story that was never completely true. I didn't know whether that story could still be undone, but for the first time since my chair disappeared from the family table, I believed the truth was finally beginning to find its way home. When I got home, I placed Linda's envelope on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it for a long time. I had waited years without knowing there were answers to my questions. Now they were sitting less than an arm's length away, and somehow I wasn't eager to open them again. The truth has a strange weight to it. Before you know it, you imagine it might be lighter than your fears. After you know it, you realize it asks something of you. I made a simple dinner but barely touched it. Instead, I spread the photocopies across the table beside Emma's drawing and the old family photograph. 3 different moments from 3 different years sat side by side. One showed the family we had been. One showed the family Emma still believed we were. The last showed decisions that had quietly changed everything without any of us realizing how far the ripples would travel. I read every page again. Nothing on those documents accused Daniel of taking advantage of me. In fact, every signature I recognized belonged to me because I had signed willingly. The records showed something different. They showed that I had never been told about financing options that would have allowed me to keep my home. They showed that Melissa had handled nearly every financial discussion with the bank. They showed that I had trusted the people sitting across the table from me more than I had questioned the paperwork in front of me. That night, I slept very little. The next morning, just after 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Daniel.
Morning, Dad. Morning. Son.
You doing anything today? The question caught me by surprise. Nothing I can't put off. I was wondering if you could stop by the office. Your office? Yeah. There was a hesitation in his voice that I hadn't heard before. I've been going through some old company files. My heart beat a little faster. Find something interesting? I'm not sure. He paused. I think I need your help understanding it. I agreed to meet him after lunch. During the drive, I kept reminding myself of Linda's advice. Don't confront anyone. Let the truth find its own voice. Daniel's construction company occupied the same brick building it had for nearly 15 years. Business seemed steady. Trucks were lined up outside, and several employees waved politely as I walked toward the entrance. They had always treated me kindly, many of them remembering the days I'd stopped by after retirement just to see how Daniel was doing. He was waiting inside his office. The moment I stepped through the door, I noticed something different. His desk was covered with file boxes. Folders lay open everywhere. He looked exhausted. Dad, you all right? I don't know. He motioned for me to sit. I've been cleaning out storage. I glanced around the room. Looks like you've been doing more than cleaning. He gave a tired smile. I found records I forgot existed. I said nothing. He reached into one of the boxes and removed an old binder. I was looking for tax documents. Instead, he opened the binder to a page covered with handwritten notes. I found meeting summaries. What kind of meetings? From when the business nearly collapsed. He stared at the page for several seconds before speaking again. I honestly don't remember half of this. I believed him. He handed me the binder. Hey. Near the top of one page, I saw Melissa's handwriting. She had always taken notes. Most of the page listed ordinary business expenses. Then one sentence caught my attention. Keep Tom focused on immediate solution. Other options create hesitation. I read it again, slowly, carefully. Daniel watched my face. Did you ever know about that? I looked up. No, his shoulders slumped. I didn't either. He leaned back in his chair and covered his face with both hands. I've been reading these for 2 days. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he lowered his hands. I remember being terrified. I know. I thought I was going to lose everything. I know. Let Melissa handle the meetings because she understood business better than I did. He shook his head. I never looked at her notes. He opened another folder. I should have. Inside were emails between Melissa and the bank manager's assistant, Leon. Daniel had printed several pages and highlighted portions in yellow. One sentence stood out immediately. Keelan's father remains willing to assist. Recommend presenting single recovery plan to avoid unnecessary confusion. Daniel swallowed hard. I don't even remember seeing these. I looked at the date. He hadn't been copied on the message. Melissa had. Another page revealed a similar exchange discussing documentation that would be simpler if handled directly. Nothing illegal. Nothing forged. Decisions made without full transparency. Daniel stared at the desk. I trusted her. I know. I trusted everyone. So did I. His eyes filled with tears. I thought you chose to sell the house because you wanted a smaller place. Lie. For a moment, I couldn't answer. He looked up.
Dad, I never wanted to leave that house.
His expression broke. I didn't know. I believe you. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. I don't understand. Neither did I. Not completely, but pieces were finally beginning to fit together. After several minutes, Daniel spoke again without turning around. There's something else. He reached into the last box and removed a small notebook. I found this yesterday. The cover was familiar, very familiar. It belonged to Melissa. She carried it everywhere during those difficult years. Daniel set it gently on the desk. I wasn't going to read it. He paused. But after everything else, he couldn't finish the sentence. I opened the notebook. Most of it contained grocery lists, appointments, and reminders. Then halfway through, I found a page that made my hands go still. Across the top, she had written, family boundaries. Below it was a list. Keep visits shorter. Heart all phone calls. Limit financial discussions. Encourage independence. Avoid emotional obligations. Maintain consistency. There were no names beside those notes. There didn't need to be. Daniel looked physically ill. I don't remember any conversation about this. Lie. I believed him because the man sitting across from me wasn't defending anyone. He was trying to understand how his own life had quietly unfolded without him seeing it. He lowered himself back into the chair. I think, his voice cracked. I think I've been losing you for years. I looked at my son. The little boy who once waited by the window for me to come home from work had grown into a man carrying a burden he hadn't even known existed. I reached across the desk and rested my hand on his shoulder, just as I had the night he came asking for help, all those finished yet. Son. He looked at me through tear-filled eyes. No, we're finally starting to understand. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the office door. Before either of us could answer, the handle turned. Melissa stepped inside. She stopped the instant she saw the notebook lying open between us. Her eyes moved from the pages to Daniel's face and finally to mine. For the first time since I'd known her, the calm certainty she always carried was gone. Melissa stood in the doorway without saying a word. For just a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming above us. Daniel looked at her, then slowly closed the notebook, but not before she realized exactly what we had been reading. I can explain, she said softly. Daniel didn't raise his voice. I think you've had years to explain. She stepped inside and quietly shut the door behind her. There was no anger on her face anymore, only exhaustion. She looked older than she had just a few days earlier, as though the weight she'd been carrying had finally become too heavy to hide. I never wanted this, she whispered. No, Daniel asked. Then what did you want? She looked at me first. I'm sorry, Thomas. Lie. It was the first time she had ever spoken my name with genuine emotion. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, I answered calmly. It doesn't, she nodded. I didn't wake up one morning planning to hurt this family. Daniel folded his arms. Then tell us how we got here. Melissa sat down slowly, keeping her eyes on the floor. When the business started failing, I was terrified. I know, Daniel said. No, I don't think you do. She took a slow breath. My father lost everything when I was 16. Our house, our savings, everything. Neither of us interrupted. I watched my parents' marriage fall apart because of money. I promised myself I'd never let that happen again. Her hands trembled slightly. When your business started collapsing, I panicked. Daniel's expression softened just a little. I thought if we lost everything, she continued, Emma would grow up the way I did, so you convinced my father to sell his home. Tears filled her eyes. Lie. I convinced myself it was temporary. She looked at me. I honestly believed we'd buy it back someday. I believed that she believed it. Fear can make people tell themselves almost anything. But that wasn't enough, Daniel said quietly. She shook her head. No. He picked up the notebook. These boundaries. Melissa closed her eyes. I didn't want Thomas becoming responsible for us forever. I never asked to be. I know that now. She wiped at her eyes. But every time Emma wanted to spend another weekend with you, every time you offered to help, every time Daniel talked about asking your advice, she stopped. I felt like we were slipping backward. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. So you started limiting my father. I told myself I was protecting our independence. And calling him dependent? She covered her face. I said things often enough that eventually I started believing them. The room fell silent again. It wasn't the silence of anger. It was the silence that comes when the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. After several moments, Daniel looked at me. Dad, his voice broke. I failed you. I stood and walked around the desk until I was beside him. No, he looked confused. I should have noticed. You should have asked more questions. I should have, but you didn't fail me because you stopped loving me. He looked down. You failed because you stopped paying attention. He nodded slowly. I did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel did something I hadn't seen him do since he was a little boy. He hugged me. Not the quick embrace from the front porch, not the polite greeting from Sunday dinner. He held on. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I closed my eyes. So am I. When we finally stepped apart, Melissa was crying quietly. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked at her. Forgiveness isn't pretending something never happened. She listened carefully. It's deciding what happens next. A week later, Daniel called and asked if everyone could come to his house the following Sunday. This time, there was something different in his voice. Hope. When I arrived, Emma met me at the front door before I even knocked. Grandpa! Leave. She threw her arms around me. I have something to show you. She grabbed my hand and practically pulled me toward the dining room. I stopped the moment I walked inside. My chair was back, not a folding chair, not another seat squeezed into a corner. My old wooden chair stood exactly where it had always belonged at the end of the table. The blue cushion Margaret had sewn years before rested on the seat. I looked at Daniel. I found it in the attic, he said quietly. I cleaned it up. I couldn't speak. Emma smiled proudly. I told Daddy Grandpa needed his chair. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked directly at me. You always did. Before anyone sat down, Daniel reached into a drawer and unfolded Emma's childhood drawing. He placed it beside my plate. The bright blue chair was still there. I found this in her room. He smiled through tears. Turns out the only person who never forgot where you belonged was an 11-year-old girl. Emma grinned. I told you. We all laughed. Lie. The first real laugh we'd shared in years. Dinner was quieter than it used to be. Not awkward, thoughtful. Sometimes healing sounds less like conversation and more like people finally listening to one another. Halfway through the meal, Daniel stood. I need to say something. He looked around the table before stopping at me. When Mom died, Dad became the strongest person I knew. His voice trembled. When my business almost failed, he saved my family without asking for recognition. He swallowed hard. And I spent years believing I had built everything on my own. He shook his head. I was wrong. He reached into a small box beside his chair. Inside was my old railroad pocket watch. I found this in one of the boxes you left at my house after you moved. He walked over and placed it in my hand. You spent your whole life giving your time to this family. He smiled sadly. I'd like to spend the rest of mine making sure none of that time is forgotten. There wasn't a dry eye at the table. Even Melissa quietly whispered, I'm sorry. This time I believed her. The weeks that followed didn't erase the past. Trust doesn't return because someone apologizes. It returns because people choose different actions day after day. Daniel began calling every Wednesday again, not because it was a habit, but because he genuinely wanted to know how I was doing. Emma came over every Saturday to bake, and before long her apple pies were almost as good as mine. Melissa asked if she could join us one afternoon. We spent more time talking than baking, and somewhere between peeling apples and washing dishes, we began rebuilding something that had nearly been lost forever. A month later, Linda invited all of us to her office. She handed me the sealed envelope Margaret had written years before. Do you still want to open it? She asked. I looked around the room. Daniel stood beside me. Melissa held Emma's hand. For the first time in a long while, my family wasn't divided. I smiled and gently placed the envelope back into Linda's hands. No. She looked surprised. I don't think we need it anymore. She smiled. I think Margaret would have liked that answer. As we walked outside together, Emma slipped her hand into mine. Grandpa? Yes, sweetheart, you'll always sit next to me. I smiled. I wouldn't want it any other way. That evening, as everyone gathered around the table once again, I looked at the chair beneath me and realized it had never really been about furniture. A chair is just wood and nails until the people around it decide who belongs there. Families aren't held together by perfect memories or flawless decisions. They're held together by the courage to face the truth, the humility to admit when we're wrong, the willingness to make room for one another again. And as my granddaughter reached over to take my hand before dinner, I quietly thanked Margaret for believing that love, when guided by truth instead of pride, could always find its way back home.